There are a lot of hypercharges in the game, and it's pretty easy to understand which ones are insanely good and which ones are very close to being a garbage can. So today I will rebalance every single hypercharge in the game, hopefully making all of them nearly equals. Hope you enjoy, and let's start with the first hypercharge, which is Shelly's hypercharge. Now, Shelly's hypercharge, it's pretty straightforward. Your super is 33% larger, plus it has some extra projectiles, which makes it slightly easier as well to cycle the super. But the one thing that it's very weird is that the hypercharge has a charge rate of 30%. This hypercharge, it's way too expensive in my opinion, especially when compared to some more recent hypercharges. So the change that I would do would be a very simple charge rate buff, from 30% to 40%. This means that instead of needing 3.33 supers, you would now only need 2.5 supers to get the hypercharge, because let's be realistic, the hypercharge is no longer that good. It made sense back then to nerf the hypercharge because Shelly was really good, but nowadays it just feels like a very unnecessary nerf to the hypercharge, honestly. Next we have the opposite. Nita, she gets the hypercharge too fast. The hypercharge is pretty good. It can be used in Heist, and in Brawl it's an insane tank counter. But the thing is, it's just way too easily cyclable. It only takes exactly 2 supers, it's a 50% rate. So I would very slightly nerf the rate from 50% to 40%. So instead of 2 supers, you would instead need 2.5. The hypercharge is really good, and in my eyes, too good. It deserves this nerf. Next we have Colt, and his hypercharge would also have its charge rate change. More specifically, from 35% to 45%. So instead of needing 2.85 supers, you would now need 2.22 supers. The hypercharge, again, it made sense to nerf it back then when the hypercharge was first released, but now it just felt like an overkill to a hypercharge that it's honestly pretty mediocre. The stats are not that big of a deal, and if we talk about the super effect, bro, it's ridiculous. So having the charge rate increased feels pretty reasonable, considering that the hypercharge it's just not that big of a deal nowadays. Next we have Bull, and his hypercharge, or more specifically the super of the hypercharge, would now also give you crowd control immunity. The hypercharge it's honestly pretty good, and you can get it so easily, so there is not much you could buff about the hypercharge, but I do think that making the hypercharge absolutely unstoppable to any sort of stun or knockback would be very good, because you already have the shield but you can still get your super interrupted, and if that happens, man, you practically just wasted your hypercharge. Not to mention that Bull itself, it's very bad right now, so I think that this buff to the hypercharge could make Bull and his hypercharge a lot better as well. Next we have Brock's hypercharge, and Brock's hypercharge was one that was changed multiple times, especially to the damage of the hypercharge super. Like, it was initially 500. Who thought 500 damage was a good idea? To be honest, I still think that 1000 damage, it's just simply not enough. Most of the times you just end up dealing 2000 damage to, in a lucky case, to 2 people, and it's honestly not that big of a deal. So I would slightly increase the damage of the hypercharge super from 1000 to 1160, so that now you would actually deal a reasonable amount of damage with the hypercharge super, because in nearly every single scenario, it's better to just use your regular super. Next we have El Primo, and man, I will never forget the disappointment that his hypercharge was. Because in the Brawl talk, they said that the radius would also be larger, but they removed it. And the hypercharge just takes so long to get. So I would just buff the radius from 2.67 tiles to 3.33 tiles. So essentially, it would be easier to land your super onto enemies, which means that would be easier to cycle your super, which means that would be a lot easier to do team wipes with your hypercharged super. So it's just so many wins, and honestly, the hypercharge just takes too long. And I don't want to just buff the raid like I did with already a lot of them, because I really want this hypercharge to be like they promised in the Brawl talk. Plus, this hypercharge is just honestly really bad. Next we have Barley, and his hypercharge is honestly a tricky one, because it takes a really long time to get it, but at the same time, it just has too much value in my opinion. And I think that the Hypercharge, it makes Barley nearly unsufferable. Like, the insane amount of area control that you get from it, it's just absurd. So what I will do, it is to reduce the bonus damage from the Hypercharge from an additional 25% to an additional 15%. This also means that your Hypercharge super will deal slightly less damage, which it is another good thing, because I do feel like, considering how massive that area is, it should not deal that much damage. And the Hypercharge, it's overall pretty good, so I feel like this nerf is pretty reasonable. Next we have Poco's Hypercharge, and I just want the Hypercharge shield duration to be increased from 5 seconds to 10 seconds. I understand that they probably put it to 5 seconds because that's the duration of the Hypercharge, but honestly, it just sounds weird because, for example, Gust shield lasts 10 seconds, most of the shields last 10 seconds. The only exception to this rule, it's this Hypercharge and Ollie, but Ollie is weird, so it doesn't really matter too much. Next we have Rosa, and I actually want a tiny reward to her Hypercharge. Instead of having the slowing area around yourself while your super is active, just straight up make the super make you invulnerable to any sort of area control. To crowd control. Because having the speed boost of the Hypercharge plus a slow, plus you have the gadget that already slows enemies down, it just feels like the most absurd and unnecessary overkill I've ever seen in terms of speed advantage. And I don't think it's really needed. Instead, give the ground control immunity, which will almost be the same thing, but it would just make harder to counter the Hypercharge and more oppressive, which it's kinda the idea of the shield anyway. Push enemies back, because guess what, you cannot push Rosa back with that Hypercharge shield, so it will have to be you going back, and it just makes sense in my eyes. Plus the Hypercharge, it's not the best, but neither it's Rosa, so I think that this change would overall be a nice buff to the Hypercharge. Next we have Jessie, and Jessie I would just add a very simple extra. When you deploy the turret would now also have a very tiny knockback area where it would also deal 2120 damage, which is the damage of your basic attack. So the reason why I would be doing this is because this Hypercharge is only really usable on Hot Zone and Heist because of how the turret works. Other than that, doesn't really do too much. So adding this tiny damage and knockback would not make the Hypercharge better in those game modes, but would make the Hypercharge a lot more versatile in general. And the Hypercharge is not that good in general, so I think that the Hypercharge does deserve this buff. Next we have Dynamite's Hypercharge, and the Hypercharge should not one-shot half of the brawlers in the game. Actually, I think it one-shots more than that, especially if you consider the damage gear as well. It's just insane. So, the damage boost from the Hypercharge would be reduced from 25% to only 5%. The Hypercharge is really good, allows you to cycle supers, and it has the plus that a couple of the Hypercharges that can cycle supers don't really have, which is just one good Hypercharge super can already kill like almost a Frank pretty much. So I think that the Hypercharge really deserves this nerf, because it's just so obnoxious sometimes. Next on the list we have Tick's Hypercharge, and this is a very simple detail, but I think it could change a lot of stuff. So you see the 6 mines that come out of the Hypercharge, what if they all came at the same time? So instead of being kinda like the regular attack when it comes one after the other, like what, a tenth of a second later, something like that, now all of those Hypercharge mines would be deployed at the exact same time. This means that it would be easier to hit someone on the upper part of the super explosion, which would make the Hypercharge slightly more offensive in some scenarios. It's a very tiny buff, but it could change some micro interactions, which honestly the Hypercharge is pretty balanced, so this very tiny buff wouldn't really change too much, but I feel like it's a good thing to have. Next we have 8-Bit's Hypercharge. Honestly, the Hypercharge, it's pretty damn mediocre. takes a long time to get, but because of how annoying and how cancer it can be, you can't really buff too many things. So what I would do is that the damage that the Hypercharge Super does would be increased from 230 per shot to 320 per shot. This would make the Hypercharge a lot more versatile in those more aggressive maps where 8-bit usually can't be picked, so I could see these making the Hypercharge a little bit more versatile because you only really see this in sniper maps. Next we have Rico's Hypercharge, and I know that Rico Hypercharge just got a very tiny Hypercharge rate nerf, but truth being said, I never cared about the Hypercharge appearing a lot of times. What I always wanted was just the damage to be reduced. It doesn't matter if the Hypercharge takes just what, 3 projectiles extra to get it. If the enemy plays just the super against the wall or even directly at the enemy, you can just shred them just too easily. So the damage multiplier of the Hypercharge would be reduced from 25% to 15%. You would still deal a good amount of extra damage, just not the obnoxious amount that you would be able to do before this nerf. Next we have Daryl's Hypercharge, and his Hypercharge would very simply have its charge rate very slightly increased from 30% to 35%. Man, is it just me or Daryl suddenly got forgotten? And I think that the Hypercharge being so damn mediocre had a greater impact on Daryl than we thought. More Hypercharges, a lot more aggressive plays to do, and Daryl's Hypercharge is just simply not good, and it takes a long time to get it. So increasing the charge rate from 3.33 supers to 2.85 supers could do a lot for Daryl. Next we have Penny's Hypercharge. Another Hypercharge got its charge rate nerfed recently, but the Hypercharge just honestly does so much. Like, the Hypercharge mortar is just honestly too strong. It's just really good. So the nerf that I would do would just be to reduce the bonus damage from the Hypercharge from 25% to only 5%. The Hypercharge mortar is already such an amazing advantage, so I don't think you really need any extras like damage or things like that, because the Hypercharge mortar is already so good. So hopefully with this nerf, Penny's Hypercharge becomes slightly more balanced. Next we have Carl, and this one might confuse you a little bit. I want the Hypercharge speed buff to stack on top of the super speed buff. So in case you don't know, the Hypercharge gives you a speed buff. This is not surprising, I hope. But in case you don't know, the super, because it goes after the Hypercharge technically, you don't really get the bonus movement speed of the Hypercharge applied to the bonus movement speed of the super. That's why it doesn't even seem that you have the speed boost while you're using your Hypercharge super, because you have, but it now feels a lot less. So if those two speed boosts could stack, I am sure that Carl's Hypercharge would be a lot better. Next we have Jackie, and these are two very simple ones. The slow duration of your Hypercharge super would be increased from 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds. The slow of the Hypercharge, it's no big deal. Let's be realistic. Most of the times the annoying thing is the bonus speed and the bonus shield, not the slow itself. Plus, now while you're pressing the Hypercharge super, there will be an extra radius where you will see the area of the actual slow, which will help you to understand how far your slow effect can actually reach. Which, both of these changes would be really tiny but nice extras to the Hypercharge, because the Hypercharge, it's no longer that big of a deal. Next we have Bo, and honestly I really like his Hypercharge, but I feel like it takes a little bit too long to get it, so I would very simply slightly increase the charge rate of the Hypercharge from 35% to 40%. This means that instead of needing 2.85 supers, you would instead need 2.5, just making the Hypercharge slightly easier to get. Next we have amps, and your Hypercharge rate to be increased from 30% to 40%. So instead of 3.36 supers, you would now need 2.5. This Hypercharge, it's not that big of a deal, so it just feels fair that it's a lot easier to get. Plus, because we now have infinite gadgets, the knockback from the hypercharge it's no longer that big of a deal. So now, the spray that you drop with the hypercharge would also silence enemies for 1 second, giving that extra aggressivity from the hypercharge to really make it worth it. Next we have Stu, and his bonus damage from the hypercharge would be reduced from 25% to only 5%. Stu is a very agile assassin. He is not a tank counter because he doesn't really deal that much damage, and neither does he recover his ammo that quickly. So why does the hypercharge changes that? I think that Stu dealing so much damage with the hypercharge makes the hypercharge really strong, and I know that his second star power got nerfed, which drastically nerfed the hypercharge, but I feel like they should have first tried to reduce the damage from the hypercharge, because that's what makes hypercharge Stu just really powerful in my opinion. So these nerfs should balance things out. Next we have Piper, and I don't know if I am the only one who has this idea, but I feel like Piper kinda fell off, and the hypercharge takes a really long time to get it, and I don't think it's the most impactful hypercharge. And if I'm being completely honest, I think that this hypercharge it's very creative and very fun, and makes sense for the hypercharge idea in general. So I would like the hypercharge rate to be very slightly increased from 35% to 40%. So instead of needing 2.85 supers, you would now need 2.5 supers. Getting that hypercharge a little bit faster could make Piper slightly more versatile and could make her a lot stronger in open maps as well because of that damage boost. Next on this we have Frank, and Frank is still good, man. Since the rework, this bro just does not die off the meta. It's impressive. So the only thing honestly left to nerf is the hypercharge. More specifically, in my opinion, the hypercharge rate. You get the hypercharge insanely fast, like really crazy, honestly. You can get easily 3 of these in a match, which is just too much. So the hypercharge rate would be reduced from 45% to 35%. So instead of needing 2.22 supers, you would now need 2.85 supers to get the hypercharge, which would make the hypercharge more meaningful because you just spam that 360 super too many times in a match. Next we have BB, and this is a very technical detail, but I feel like it's very important. So, in case you don't know, if you use the second gadget together with the hypercharge, your bubble actually does not split, which is so bad. Imagine if the splitted bubbles could also slow the enemies down. That would give so much value to that very underwhelming gadget, and it would make the hypercharge a lot better, because the hypercharge it is already quite good. And on top of that, the first gadget just became so much better with the rework to the gadget cooldown. So I feel like this very tiny and technical buff would be just honestly so good for BB. Next FB, and honestly I think that is more of a precaution type of thing, but I just want the hypercharge bonus damage to be reduced from 25% to 15%. Am I the only one scared of the fact that she can deal 5,500 damage with only one single projectile? Not to mention that she can probably do that twice within that hypercharge duration, because to me that just feels insane. Like, I don't want B to just shred me like if I was a piece of butter. I don't really want that at all, so this tiny nerf would probably fix most of those very strong interactions because of the bonus damage of the hypercharge. Next we have Nani, and honestly her hypercharge just sucks. Even with the stat buffs, it's no big deal. But I don't want to just make it easier to get, because the super, it's a very technical super, let's call it like that. So what I would want instead is that your hypercharge super would now leave a fire trail, and this fire trail would deal 1600 damage over 4 seconds, so 400 damage per second. And this would be really good because you would now have area control with the hypercharge, which could be very helpful in especially in long range maps where the stat increases might not come as obvious or as helpful. So I think that this buff to the Hypercharge, it is very justified because the Hypercharge, it's not even that good. Next we have Edgar, and his charge rate would be increased from 40% to 45%. So instead of needing 2.5 supers, you would now only need 2.22 supers. The thing is, his Hypercharge, it's the only thing that really keeps Edgar alive as a brawler. Other than that, he kinda sucks. So getting the Hypercharge faster would be a massive benefit because honestly, Edgar needs it. The gadget rework did not help him at all. Next we have Gale, and honestly, his Hypercharge, even though it's very strong, it never appears in the match. When this thing got nerfed to 25% rate, it made sense, but then they also nerfed the charge rate of the super, and that make getting the Hypercharge nearly impossible. So reverting that Hypercharge charge rate nerf would make the Hypercharge appear a little bit more often in the battle, which I am sure Gale would appreciate that. Next we have Colette, and this is another very technical change, but now if Colette dies during the Hypercharge super, the ego despawns. This is just to solve those very annoying times where you killed Colette but the ego still kills you. It's just so unnecessary, and it just makes the Hypercharge a little bit, actually not just a little bit, very noob unfriendly, and it's just an annoying extra that you have to deal with from time to time, and honestly, I don't really like it. So honestly, it should just be removed because I also think the Hypercharge is pretty good overall. Next we have Belle, and her Hypercharge super would now briefly stun the enemy for half a second. This is to make the Hypercharge just a tiny bit more offensive. Even though the target it's very good to burst down, no, but to deal with tanks over time, other than that doesn't really do too much. So I think that this tiny stun would allow Belle to be a little bit more aggressive with the Hypercharge, which is the whole point of Hypercharges in general right now, so in my eyes it makes perfect sense, this tiny buff. Next we have Ashe, and your Hypercharge super, the reds would now have a random spawn position. This means that the reds would just randomly spawn within that tiny circle. And this will make the Hypercharge super actually just harder to counter, because the annoying part with the Ashe's Hypercharge is that it's an absolute overkill against single shot brawlers, but if even one dude has piercing abilities, you might as well forget, they're just gonna destroy all of the rats with 1 or 2 ammo. So making the rats spawn random in that position would make it harder for even piercing brawlers being able to counter the Hypercharge, which honestly would be a very good tiny buff to the Hypercharge. Next on the list we have Mandy's Hypercharge. Now, if I'm being completely honest, this thing took me by surprise because I was genuinely not expecting this to actually be good. Like, I am still surprised how this even works. So what I'm honestly still going to do anyway would be to increase the charge rate of the Hypercharge from 40% to 50%. Honestly, most of the times it's just luck if she hits the Hypercharge, and the Hypercharge is just bonus damage mainly, and for most of the cases just don't go near her if she has the Hypercharge. I don't think it's that big of a deal, the Hypercharge, but I clearly see its potential now, especially after dying to it once or twice. But I still feel like the Hypercharge is overall on the weaker side, so this tiny buff would make the Hypercharge a little bit better. Next we have Maisie, and her Hypercharge bonus damage would be reduced from 25% to 5%. Am I the only one who thinks that her Hypercharge is absolutely obnoxious? Like, you just get absolutely destroyed with this thing. Like, she just hits one of the projectiles of the Hypercharge super on you, and you're practically dead. So, and not to mention that it also charges her Hypercharge super even more. So, I think that reducing the bonus damage of the Hypercharge would be really good because she already deals so much damage. So, I don't understand why would the Hypercharge just add even more of that. Next on the list, we have probably one of the most controversial Hypercharges on this update because it can be so good or so bad. It's honestly all about timing that hypercharge well and getting the right spot to not get your super hit by a wall. But I think I have a good idea to rebalance the hypercharge, which would be actually a nerf to the Hank's actual super, which would be reducing the super range by 50%. So instead of having 20 tiles of range, your super will now instead have 10. Now, these will not change too much your regular super, but for the hypercharge, it essentially means that if the guided missile for some reason misses the target, it would most likely not hit anyone by mere accident, like the torpedoes swapping lanes with each other. That wouldn't really happen because now the missiles would not travel as far. So I am pretty sure that this would be the perfect way to nerf this hypercharge. Next we have Pearl's hypercharge, and while inside her burning area of the super, your hit meter gets increased by 25% per second. This means that if you started the hypercharge super with 0% hit, if you just stand on the hypercharge super, you will be at full hit after the hypercharge. This would be really good, especially on more passive maps where she is used a lot. So yay, the hypercharge would now actually be helpful. How crazy is that? Next we have Angelo, and his hypercharge takes too long to get. The hypercharge doesn't really do that much, especially because you can't really take as much advantage of the damage buff that you get from it. So now the charge rate would be increased from 35% to 45%. So instead of needing 2.85 supers, you would now need 2.22 supers. Again, the hypercharge doesn't really do too much, so it shouldn't cost as much. Next we have Barry, and Barry is one of those weird guys that has 15% bonus damage and 15% bonus shield, and honestly, I don't really like the 15% bonus damage because it just allows you to just heal and deal just a lot more damage, and I feel like he shouldn't really do that because he already does that so well. The bonus damage just feels kinda like overkill, and considering how easily you get the hypercharge, man, this nerf is pretty justifiable. Next we have Morty's hypercharge, and honestly this is one of the most obnoxious hypercharges of them all because it destroys everything, and I'm not joking, it's absurd. So now when the super comes back, the damage and the charge rate and the heal as well, because it's lifesteal, would be reduced by 50%. This would make it slightly harder to cycle through the supers of the hypercharge, and it would also reduce the heal a little bit because hypercharge Mortis just destroys your team and has full HP. Again, his hypercharge is one of those hypercharges that you don't really need to play it at full HP to get value from it, which is a very good advantage to have. And honestly, this hypercharge is just so good. There is no amount of times that I can say that this hypercharge is good to make you see my point. Next we have Tara, and honestly, this is, in my opinion, one of the most balanced hypercharges the game has. But if I had to change something, I would just make so that the hypercharge super would last on the floor an additional second, so that you could pull enemies and have a little bit of more area control with the actual super outside of the explosion, which could be really good. But again, I think that the hypercharge is perfectly good as it is, so this buff is more for the video, honestly. You know what else is for the video? Asking you to subscribe, please! We are getting closer and closer to that 10k subscriber mark, and I know we can do this. I mean, we've reached so far, and I'm so thankful for your support. So subscribe, watch more videos in the channel if you're interested, and join our Discord server as well. Link in the description. Thank you so much, and let's talk about Gene. So now his hypercharge super, for each connection you would get a 1k shield, and this shield would decay in 10 seconds like all shields should. So the thing is, if you connect one super, you will still get bonus shield, which is good. But if you connect 3 people, like let's just say by a little bit of an accident, instead of instantly getting absolutely destroyed, you would have bonus HP, and that could be the difference between surviving and not surviving. So I think that this buff would be very helpful for the hypercharge and could change a lot of stuff about grabbing 3 people at once. Next we have Max, and this is the reward that I've been asking for ages. Just don't make the hypercharge super bottles stack, but make them, instead of charging 25% of the super, charge 40%. The hypercharge in my eyes never really needed that charge rate nerf. It just needs to have this interaction fixed, because that's what makes the hypercharge truly annoying. Because if played correctly, you'll just cycle supers like crazy. And that's not a bad thing, but the problem is it requires too much planning, and truth being said, most people don't even know that's a possibility, so I think that this kinda secret interaction should honestly just be taken away. Next we have Mr. P, and this will be a crazy nerf to the hypercharge, but I think the charge rate should be reduced from 35% all the way down to 25%. So instead of needing 2.85 supers, you would now need 4 full supers. Why? Because the hypercharge is just too good. But at the same time, I like the way how the hypercharge is played. People should understand to not feed Mr. P's super, but the problem is, once you get the hypercharge, the enemy team is essentially dead. There is not much they could do, especially because in comparison to every single other hypercharged spawnable, this one can be played back into spawn, and no one would be dumb enough to just go there and try to destroy the hypercharge porter. It's just so many stuff to the hypercharge, and especially the fact that you can put it at spawn and still get practically the same value, that's just too much, honestly. Next we have Sprout, and your hypercharge super would now also slow enemies for 1 second. So every time you would get that 500 damage, you would also get slowed by 1 second. And I think that this could be a very dangerous extra. I mean, with the gadget, you just leave that thingy there, which already is kinda good, but now it's slowing down enemies like that Squeak's gadget, but for 10 seconds. And I know that requires a hypercharge and a gadget, but the hypercharge charges relatively fast, unless you're playing on knockout. But still, I could see this buff being very underrated, yet pretty powerful in my opinion. Next on the list we have Squeak, and his charge rate would be increased from 40% up to 50%. So instead of needing 2.5 supers, you would need 2 supers. I know Squeak is kinda broken right now, mainly because of the first gadget, but it's just a matter of time until that cooldown gets nerfed, so everything would then go back to normal. And Squeak's hypercharge, it's not that big of a deal, it's 2 supers, so it should cost exactly 2 supers, because the hypercharge is not even that good. Next on the list we have Lou, and I know his hypercharge just got a massive nerf to its charge rate, but I still think that the hypercharge can hold too much value, especially if you can cycle supers well, which against noobs, it's not that hard. So now the bonus damage that the hypercharge gives you would be reduced from 25% to 15%. You would still deal 1000 damage per cone, but I just feel like because you have a guaranteed stun with the hypercharge, you should not be able to shred enemies just so easily. It just gives you so much damage, that hypercharge, that essentially makes you one of the most aggressive damage dealers you could ever see in your life. And Louis is a controller, obviously, so I don't think he should have that kind of power. Next we have Ruff's hypercharge, and this hypercharge would have 2 buffs. Number 1, now the hypercharge would also give the super to the allies, so now you would have even more value from the pickup. Plus, now if you collect the pickup, even if you already have one, you would still get the hypercharge effect, which would be getting the super and the hypercharged fully recharged. So I think that this would make the hypercharge a lot more versatile, because the problem is most of the times you can't really use this, because most of the times if you play well, all of your teammates will have the pickup active, so there is not much value you can get from the hypercharge. So both of these buffs should give a lot more value and versatility to this hypercharge. Next on the list we have Buzz's hypercharge, and now the hypercharge would also give him a 25% shield instead of 15%. I don't think that his hypercharge is bad, but it definitely had better days. So in my eyes, having the bonus shield, because Buzz kinda plays like a tank, would change a lot about his hypercharge. And honestly, as time has passed by, his hypercharge is just no longer as powerful, so this would really help Buzz out, because not even Buzz is that good right now. Next we have Fang's Hypercharge, and the charge rate would be increased from 20% to 25%. So instead of needing a whopping 5 supers, you would now instead only need 4 supers. It's still a lot, but I mean 5 supers is just too much. Fang's Hypercharge, it's still a really good Hypercharge and it is pretty powerful, but they just over-nerfed the charge rate. It's now borderline impossible to get his Hypercharge, so this would kinda fix that issue. Next we have Eve's Hypercharge, and it would have 2 changes. Both the bonus speed and bonus damage would be reduced from 25% to 15%. But now the Hypercharge Super, instead of losing HP based on its maximum HP, it would lose HP instead on its current HP. What does this mean? Well, it technically means that now you cannot just destroy the value of your Hypercharge Super with just one hit, because it would lose HP based on the maximum HP, so the egg would die and it would not spawn the hatchlings. So with this change, even if an enemy hit one mine, because it would then lose HP on the current HP, it would still need more attacks in order to destroy the egg. Essentially, the egg would never destroy itself. It would always need one attack to finish the egg, which would overall be a buff to the Hypercharge. Therefore, I would slightly nerf its stat buffs to make the Hypercharge more fun, honestly. Next, F Janet, and her Hypercharge charge rate would be reduced from 50% to 40%. So now it would be harder to get the Hypercharge, and it was the Hypercharge that essentially made Janet very good again, and the Hypercharge, it is pretty strong, so this tiny nerf should make the Hypercharge more balanced. Next we have Odie's Hypercharge, and the Hypercharge Super, instead of stunning the enemy for 1.5 seconds, it would now taunt them for 1.5 seconds. So now, not only you would get that ability Interrupt, like the Hypnotize does, but now you'd also make the enemies come closer to you. And this would be a massive advantage, because Otis is especially good in close range, because he can just deal so much damage. So calling the enemies to get near you, that is a death sentence. The stun can be good, but sometimes at longer range it becomes kinda useless. So this buff would make Odie's Hypercharge a lot more meaningful and a lot more dangerous as well. Next we have Gray's Hypercharge, and would have not 1 but 2 nerfs. To start off, the charge rate would be very slightly reduced from 45% to only 40%. The Hypercharge has too much value and you get it too quickly, honestly. But on top of this, the Hypercharge Super now despawns after 30 seconds in the field. So if you take too long to get your Hypercharge again, that thing just disappears suddenly. It's not fair for you to have just an eternal Hypercharge on the field for just so long. And I think that it's only now that people are truly understanding the power of this Hypercharge. So I'm really expecting a nerf to this Hypercharge eventually. And this DK to the extra portal would be the ideal option in my opinion. Next we have Charlie, and her Hypercharge would have 2 changes. To start off, the spiders, instead of spawning when you connect the cocoon, they would now spawn when the cocoon gets destroyed. Attention, they would still spawn if you miss the super. But on top of this, now instead of spawning regular spiders, you would now summon Hypercharged spiders. These spiders would have similar buffs to Mr. P. They would have more HP, so they would have, instead of the 1400, they would have 2200. Their HP decay would be increased from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, and on top of that, they would be faster. I don't know how much faster, but around 25% faster seems pretty reasonable. The Hypercharge sucks, and there is nothing you can say that will prove otherwise. Next we have Miko, and honestly just make his Hypercharge charge rate go from 50% all the way to 60%. So now instead of needing 2 supers, you would instead only need 1.66. So this would allow you to just get those aggressive plays with the Hypercharge a lot more frequently, because you would get the stat buffs and just kill the enemies, and while you had those stat buffs you would get the Hypercharge super. So that would be a massive win, because honestly Miko just sucks right now, and I think that a big part of it's because the Hypercharge is just not good. Next we have Melody, and I want the bonus damage from the Hypercharge to be reduced from 25% to only 5%. You already have the bonus notes around you, dealing additional 600 damage, so why exactly do you need an additional 25% damage? It seems overkill. And Melody is really good, and so is the Hypercharge, so I really don't think you need any bonus damage because the Hypercharge is already so good. Next we have Spike, and his Hypercharge would now also give him a 15% shield. This would allow you to just be more aggressive. Spike did get a bunch of HP buffs, but he's just not that good still. So an extra shield with the Hypercharge could do a lot for him, and I generally think that he deserves because Spike and his Hypercharge are just not that good anymore. Next we have Crow, and his Hypercharge would have a massive buff and a tiny nerf. So the tiny nerf would be that the bonus damage would be reduced from 25% to 15%. I genuinely think that shredding the high safe that easily, it's kinda illegal in my opinion. So that should be slightly nerfed. As for the massive buff is that every single poison while you are hypercharged has double the duration. This means that just getting hit by your basic attack while you are hypercharged means that you'll receive in total like what, 1600 damage if you have the mythic gear and without considering damage gear and the hypercharge bonus damage. So this would allow the hypercharge to be more indicative of what Crow actually does. He's a controller and his hypercharge is just pure damage, so I don't really see why they went this way, but it's an old hypercharge regardless, and it's honestly kinda outdated as well, so this buff would allow the hypercharge to be a lot more meaningful. On top of that, it would slightly reduce its offensiveness in highs, which is, in my opinion, the worst thing that the hypercharge could have. Next we have Leon, and his hypercharge charge rate would be increased from 30% to 35%. So instead of needing 3 supers, actually 3.33 supers, you would now only need 2.85 supers. And this would be a really good buff because now you'd be able to cycle those hypercharges a lot more easily. So it would be a really great buff overall. Leon is kinda weak right now in my opinion, even with the gadget buff. So this buff to the hypercharge could be what he really needs. Next on the list we have Sandy, and the hyper super silence duration would be increased from half a second to 1 second. I generally think that the hypercharge it's no longer as good. The speed buff it's good, but nothing that impressive anymore. I think that her hypercharge got slightly outdated, and because it does take a little bit to get the hypercharge, I think that also kinda was a big nerf to the hypercharge itself. So this tiny buff to the silence duration could do a lot for Sandy. Next we have Surge's hypercharge, and the charge rate would be increased from 20% to 25%, so instead of needing 5 supers, you would now instead only need 4 of them. But to compensate, the bonus damage would be reduced from plus 15% to plus 5%. You can shred so easily with the hypercharge, but you might never get the hypercharge, which is pretty sad. So getting the hypercharge more often, but without bursting enemies as easily, I am sure that's an overall buff, and this would just make the hypercharge more fun overall. So I think that this would be the perfect change to this hypercharge. And lastly, we have Cordelia's hypercharge, and very simply, the charge rate would be increased from 25% to 30%. So instead of needing 4 supers, you would now instead only need 3.33. The hypercharge it's good, but it's not really that impressive, honestly. They could have done so much considering that he was a legendary, but oh well, that's just how hypercharges work. So this buff would probably make a lot of good stuff for the hypercharge and Cordelius, because I think that he has been kinda disappearing for a while. So this buff it's pretty deserved in my opinion. So there you have it. A change to every single hypercharge in the game at the moment. What are your thoughts? And write your opinion in the comments down below. Trust me, I will read them. Subscribe, join our Discord server, and I'll see ya on the next video.